The year is 1979, and TSR changes the entire gaming world with the release of the first edition of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeons Master's Guide, or the DMG. The project had already started in 1971 when Gygax had formed TSR along with a few other people and created the Chainmail game. In 1974 comes the release of the first version of Dungeons & Dragons, a very basic, thin game with a very narrow rule set. This original Dungeons & Dragons becomes the basic set and the expert set that we grew up with. Gygax, on the other hand, felt that that was too narrow. So he went about the process of writing down a new system, an advanced system, a full system. First coming out with the Player's Handbook in 1978, and then coming out with the most strange book that has ever been seen in the role-playing game world, the Dungeon Master's Guide, which is just bizarre, labyrinthine, Babylonian-like tables, strange artwork, and honestly, things which look like the occult were actually much more in common with statistical mechanics and probabilities. In fact, many people would have their first experiences of a probability curve by just looking at the DMG and playing around with the dice rolls. Today we're going to talk with Ben Philgrin, archivist and historian and game enthusiast, this little thin, obsessive, let's say. And we're going to talk about AD&D, the DMG, and that first edition. That was a critical fail. When was the first time, what was your first experience? When was the first time you saw both the Player's Handbook and the DMG? What did it look like when you first saw those?
The artwork on the covers were really fascinating. They basically showed aspects of what playing the game would be like, or at least how it would seem in your imagination. One was, on the Player's Handbook, two guys were crawling over a giant statue to take the gems that it had for eyes. And on the Dungeon Master's Guide were 3 or 4 people fighting some kind of giant or demon some 3 times their height.
So, but again, though, you weren't actually, again, everyone would buy the Player's Handbook and the DMG, but you weren't actually supposed to look through the DMG if you were a Dungeon Master.
A lot of people didn't even have a Player's Handbook. I started playing, I was 8 years old. My brother is 4 years older than I am. So getting books often involved people scraping together money, except for that one guy who had everything, but he was the DM. And first we had the Player's Handbook. I read through that, but we started with Basic. My brother received Basic and the next set after the Expert set as box sets for Christmas one year. And it wasn't for a couple of years after that until we leapt into Advanced.
In Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, what was gameplay like when you didn't have any idea what was actually in the mechanics of the game? Because again, the idea is that you would just have the Player's Handbook and you would never actually know what the actual rules of the game were.
A lot of the rules were in the Player's Handbook. You knew how to deal with combat, for example, which is a lot of the game. A lot of where the rules of the game come in. Otherwise, it's a lot of talking that doesn't need so many rules. The
Dungeon Master's Guide isn't a fiction book. In fact, it's mostly
it's
tables.
Practically a conversation combined with tables. Every edition of the Dungeon Master's Guide since is a reference book. And it reads a lot like that. It's trying to read an encyclopedia straight through. It's information for the game, so I read them because I love playing the game. But I pass out a lot for it because it's some dry reading. The first edition was a conversation. He wrote the book because the original systems, Basic and Advanced, had rules to play and rules to run things, but he felt that those rules weren't enough and that the game was running amok. That people were running multi-hall campaigns and getting things too easily, and therefore not enjoying it.
So explain what a Monty Hall campaign is. That's an old, I don't even think people even remember who Monty Hall is. We're men of a certain age.
Oh, yes. Monty Hall. Well, okay, Monty Hall, when we were kids, was the screen name of a man who ran a game show. But Monty Hall is an older term which has to do with freebooting and thievery. And so the Monty Hall campaign is one where there's a newer term that makes more sense of it called murder hobos. And the name says it all. So a Monty Hall campaign is where a bunch of murder hobos going around killing everything and taking what they have for themselves.
Okay. And so Gygax put together even the DMG.
Mm-hmm.
Again, from tournament play, from
years of experience with his own players and as a player himself.
So again, he's playing the game from 1974 to 1979 when the game comes out. So again, for those first 5 years, it's a really limited rule set.
Yes, and a lot of them were built off of the basic set, or with only slight differences, or just made more detailed.
Yeah.
Longer charts, a lot of things. But the Dungeon Master's Guide is an attempt to teach somebody how to make a world for their players to play in. Oddly enough, he never says campaign world, he never says world or reality, he always uses the word milieu. Mm-hmm. When creating your milieu, try to do this, etc. And the whole book is him writing it's as if it was a grandfather writing to his grandson his experiences and what he's learned, and don't do this because this is bad for what you're going to do.
Because again, at this point, there are no other really role-playing games. This is the first real.
It is the original, as far as I know.
So let me ask you a question. What's in there?
There are so many things. He talks about creation of the game world, starting with the small section where the party starts. Dungeons & Dragons informed a lot of video games, so that's actually a good way to explain it. In a lot of video games, you start, especially if there's a story-based one, you start in a small area. Mm-hmm. You are not capable of a lot because you're still learning what you can do in terms of how the game works and what you do with it. And you go around, you meet maybe a few people, and then you go off to deal with the greater story. And as you go on to deal with the greater story, the world expands. You leave maybe that small town or that room, and you start to see other areas.
And so the DMG helps you build that out?
He goes into a lot of detail about how you might go about creating that. There's a part of first edition D&D that doesn't exist anymore, which was at a certain level for certain classes, you would get followers as long as you had a stronghold. If you were a priest, if you had a temple that you made and owned, then a number of like-minded people would come and follow you, and you would be the high priest of that place. The Player's Handbook mentions this, but a lot of people didn't realize that the way he envisioned it, the player would have to find the land, pay for the construction, and only at that point that he had built it would they come. Mm.
Like you mentioned the Monty Hall campaigns, that for the first time he builds in all these extraordinarily complex tables of treasure types.
The tables already existed in the old ones, and he, in the portion, I forget exactly, early in the book, he speaks of his regret for having put those numbered charts in, because that gave people the impression that things should just be rolled upon, and that that a first level character might be able to find a staff of fireballs.
This is a book where you can generate literally dungeons at random.
Although, in the course of the book itself, he doesn't really recommend that. He thinks that things should be carefully thought out and built out, except maybe random encounters. But he does have that if you just want to, say, try it out. I think that whole section, it's good 10, 20 pages, really informed games like Diablo.
Mm-hmm. Why?
Diablo is always random maps. There are basic, say on a given level that you're on for the original Diablo, it will have certain artifacts so that it'll have a theme of look, but the actual layout of the floor will be different every time you go into the dungeon. Well, not exactly. While you're playing the game, it'll stay the same. But when you stop the game, come back to play again, the first level will be rewritten, and so will every other.
And then there are all the random insanity tables, all these sort of things that were just almost like bombs in the game. Did you get into this?
That still gets criticism because it was ever there in the first place. Insanity is still discussed in D&D games, but people tend to disagree with him because it's a world. This is a world with people who do suffer from various things, and they tend to say that's not how it works. And so I try to avoid dealing with insanity in my games.
In the first version of this game, it's a racialized game.
Oh yes, right.
There's prejudice against half orcs, there's
Tons
elves
of.
and dwarves. I mean,
Tons of. There are a number of what are now races in the game, considered playable races, that were always monster races in the earlier games. And his idea of them was that they were primitive and incapable of sufficient organization to be like elves or dwarves. He also assumed that humans were, let's say 60 or more percent of any population, that it was always going to be a humanocentric world, and everybody else was just, sort of there.
I mean, you could explain
There's a lot of bias, although there's a lot of bias in general. He assumes very specific things, which he suggests, but it only has to do with the way he made his game, and also says, hey, if you want to base yours on another setting entirely, please do, but I made my game based on medieval Europe, and so those are the structures involved.
And that's all radically changed in the new Dungeons &
Dragons. Nowadays it's a much more inclusive game because some people decided they want to play a character that is an orc without having to necessarily live through prejudice. We want to play a game. Why should I live through prejudice? Why should I play a game where I'm dealing with lifelike prejudice?
Do you miss this style of gameplay, or is it? Are there, for example, there are people who go, but there are the people who still. Like people who go with different projects.
Still love to play the original, but I've been playing for so long. I have what people call a forever DM. I almost never get to play a character. But this has given me a particular insight into players. People just want to have fun. They don't want to deal with tons of minutia. Maybe a little minutia. It is a game. It's a game played by a lot of nerds. So dealing with math, well, that's not work. I don't care how many beers it is, I'll still be able to do addition and subtraction, right? And there's so many ways in which I can go with that question. The inspiration has gone in so many ways. I think Dungeons & Dragons even inspired video games that don't have anything to do with fantasy, like Castle Wolfenstein. Mm-hmm. If you were to just consider the game, you wake up in a cell, some dying man gives you a gun and says you have to break out of here.
When you say minutia, that's really what the DMG is about, right?
It doesn't have to be, but there's a lot of it in there.
Yeah. So basically, he threw everything in he could possibly think about, you think?
He tried to throw in the kitchen sink. He tried to help teach people how to make worlds like he had, in the way that he had, and which is. It was good and bad, because some people stuck to exactly the way he did things, always without any variation.
Talk about the artwork, both on the cover and inside.
Well, the artwork on the cover certainly got my attention. The artwork inside it continues, even to today, to make me laugh. In the Dungeon Master's Guide, the original, there's a little inset, little comic-like inset, where fantasy characters are sitting around and talking. One of them is reading a book, and one says, "Oh, this is a fantastic new game where we pretend that we are living in this technologically advanced setting and having adventures. And it's called Papers and Paychecks."
I think there's another one where they're coming around a corner and there's a rust monster.
Oh no, the rust monster! I love that. No, the rust monster is a fighter in armor who has jumped into the arms of a wizard out of fear of the rust monster.
Oh, I mean, it's funny because it's but at the same time, there's serious drawings in there that would go on to really set the style for what Dungeons & Dragons would actually look like.
Dungeons & Dragons has always been like that. Every game that I've always played, although people do play games differently, from the way I've always seen it, whether I played or ran things, there is seriousness. For example, the combat, the big bad evil guy and his evil laugh, but there has to be time for fun and laughs to diffuse attention or just to goof off.
So how is that first go at Dungeons & Dragons, how is it different than all of the role-playing games that basically it invented? I mean, even compared to, for example, Dungeons and Dragons today, or compared to any other role-playing game like Vampire or any of the other games that exist today?
Dungeons and Dragons was originally a war game. Actually, chainmail, where Dungeons and Dragons come from, and it was much like Warhammer. People would take their little figurines, and they had rules for battling each other. Similar systems had been made for other types of soldiers and warriors, but that was always a niche market. Once this started to happen, it coincided with the popularity, the resurgent popularity of Tolkien's writings in the late 60s, early 70s. At the same time, you had a number of really amazing writers who had created amazingly complex worlds that were inspiring people to make their own worlds.
And so those books are actually credited in the DMG, right?
Oh, but yes, or at least the authors, so that the players could go and find out what inspired him.
So that when that Dungeon Master's Guide first went out, it literally introduced a whole generation to the last 100 years of fantasy novels.
Absolutely. He explicitly discusses Conan several times in the Dungeon Master's Guide, besides, of course, citing Burroughs later on in his mentions. These 4 books, right? These are actually parts of a very large story that was an epic story that talked about magic coming back from to the world after having been gone for 1,000 years, and how that coincided with the reawakening of dragons and an epic fight of good versus evil in the world. And that was inspired by the original Dungeon Master's Guide.
Dungeons and Dragons has always been about books.
Oh yeah.
And fundamentally, again, what we're seeing here on this table, could you just sort of, again, talk about, again, we have something by Gary Gygax here?
Gary Gygax himself, a novel. I haven't read this one myself. I just happened to find it in my collection of books. I don't know how it got there. Well, it probably came from my brother. And this one I read, this is from the Forgotten Realms, which is the first big world after the original.
And this is all stuff that came after the DMG to fill it in.
Oh yeah, well this book was written in the 80s.
So what's here underneath? This is...
Oh, that is...
And this is the first real big mod to...
This is the first printing of the Unearthed Arcana. See how much I've used it. Spines take a lot of damage.
Let's open that up a little bit for the camera there. Can we use that right side?
And this was an expansion to the player's handbook. And
also the DMG, because this rule sets in there.
Oh, that's true. There are rule sets in the back. New spells.
Take a look there, yeah. Again, this is stuff that's hard to get, to be honest. I mean, like, that's the reason why we don't have a DMG.
Nowadays.
I mean, this would be unfindable nowadays. Look at that. It's fascinating, like, when you see this stuff. But again, this is all fundamentally about books. This is about...
Oh, yes.
Dungeons & Dragons is a literary game.
Absolutely. Longtime players have significant libraries. A whole bookcase, if not a couple.
So it's almost the culture of literature that is being played out in a game like that.
Oh, sure. And every player I've met has read several books that not just Tolkien, which is sort of like the intro drug, but so many other people. The names I mentioned before. This series here, Dragonlance, was a book series. The book series is fantastic. The authors really did a wonderful job in presenting their world very slowly and carefully, and then revealing it along the way. So I have met people over the years who've read the book, never played D&D. Love the books, never played the game.
What is the one feature from that DMG that you would like to see brought into a modern role-playing game? What's the one thing that you miss?
One thing I miss? I'm not sure about missing it. It's because I still read it. It's available online because it's so far out of print. And I still find great value in so many of the little things. But it's not like one section. Because he's written it almost as a narrative, it has to be gone through to find the little gem that fits. It's not in a particular order, and even in discussing it, he might discuss the same topic in 3 different places in the book. Because it's sort of, like I said, a letter from Grandpa, so it occurs to him as it occurs to him.
And so again, you have things like roles for the magic, like not just for roles magic items, but the components for magic items, like an herb list that you can find at a shop.
That was it's not a role list. It's just an herb. It is that, but also it's a list with that list also lists the possible magical properties. That's so that the DM could create realistic formulae for alchemy or even spells. For new spells, let's say people wanted to create a new spell. Well, okay, fine. Determine, what you want to do. Well, then the DM can look at this list and see if there's some kind of gem or herb that has a related concept, right? For example, there's most of this stuff comes from real folklore. Rubies, for example, in some of our other culture are associated with healing. So if somebody wanted to make a gem that healed, they would use a ruby instead of another gem. That was the purpose of those charts.
Okay, and then, but again, it's like the charts to be rolled on, not just to be thought about.
Some of them to be, there are charts to be rolled on, but you don't always have to roll. Just about every time it says, well, you can roll on these charts or choose what you need. Mm-hmm. People like the rolls, though. They really do.
Yes, they do. So awesome. No, but it's interesting because I mean, again, it's such a difference because if you play a modern role-playing game, mm-hmm. I mean, other than your basic tables you may have in your character sheet, you may never even need to look at it. I mean, in 5th edition, how many? I mean, once you've got your character made,
quite a bit, especially as you go up in level. Everybody keeps on getting powers in higher levels. So even though you're not doing necessarily the paperwork of a wizard, at 9th level, a fighter even has an array of abilities that might take up a page or two of text that he has to understand. Well, he better understand, or the DM is going to be very mad at him.
But that's also, yes, that's not actually in the DMG. That's all been outsourced to the characters.
No, that's in the player's handbook.
Yeah,
sure.
It's all in place. So there's not a ton of these weird mechanics.
The current Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition doesn't really talk about anything like that. It talks about raking realities, talks about the nature of the different planes of existence that are assumed in D&D. It goes over how to deal with NPCs, including your big bad evil guy. Things like that. Try to make your game come alive.
Not like how fast you expect a war cart to go or a war chariot to travel.
No.
Or how much weight a war chariot could
How much
take.
it would cost to buy a wagon. Actually, that's the thing. How much would it cost to buy a basket? Charts like totally mundane things like that. Oh, well, an egg will cost a penny or two. He actually did have lists of things like that.
Like in theory, you're supposed to calculate how much your character can carry.
Yeah,
but yes, it's all there in the
that's such a trouble. Again, excess paperwork.
Yeah. That's all gone now.
I mean, I'm sure that you've played old video games where they actually dealt with things like that. That was a ton of trouble. You use a computer to deal with it. Mm-hmm.
And so it's almost like that original Dungeons and Dragons, the original DMG, is almost like the hidden tool set, the hidden rule set on a video game, more than what we would consider role playing today.
Yes, it really is a guide, right? So as I said, it's not a reference guide in the normal way, even though it has a table of contents and an index so you can go looking around for what you need to know, but it isn't laid out that way in the first place. It is advice, and tons of it. There's even advice for players getting out of hand. There's advice for creating that new stronghold that the high-level fighter gets. He goes into how to go about creating a map. It goes about how the player should try to start securing the land around, or if he doesn't, then things will start to encroach and destroy his attempt at creating civilization. Oh, that's another thing. The assumption was, when it came to creation of that fighter's fortress or whatever, was that it was far away from civilization. He doesn't explain why, just that's his assumption. He does state that maybe a king might give somebody an existing castle, but generally it wouldn't have. He wanted people to be out in the wilderness, out on the frontier somewhere, conquering the wild.
And that, I guess, is what really sums up what that first edition of AD&D was. It was going out into the wild that no one had ever seen before in gameplay. And now you expect a lot more from a role-playing game. You expect them to give you a world and a narrative style. Whereas in Gygax, it's just so like this guy for the first time figuring this all out.
Right. Well, the newer games, like I say, people have so many tools. I've read online, people take existing maps and possibly rotate them. George R.R. Martin, for the land of Westeros, the main continent where everything takes place, he said in multiple interviews, is Ireland flipped upside down.
Because again, it's all that story, that narrative behind it now. Whereas in the original Dungeons and Dragons, he has no idea what the story is. He's just figuring it out as he goes along.
Some of it, from what I understand, was tournament-like play. It was just a matter of dungeon delving and tomb robbing. He had story in there that he knew that the players may or may not find, and I don't know if they often found it. A lot of the time, he had a place called Castle Greyhawk. And it was a castle, but the real place was an immensely large dungeon complex underneath. And one of the tricks and traps, of which there were many, was an imprisoned demon lord whose whole existence revolved around trickery and illusion. And he was trapped in there, so he couldn't do much, but he could communicate with people who got too close. And two of the players, he was the DM of this at the time, two of his players released that god, and that is now a demon lord that's been in the game world ever since.
Can we just shoot really fast? You had said you actually died in the room on the so that really fast before we go?
You got it? The Village of Hamlet is one of the first adventures written by Gary Gygax. I died in this very room here in the basement of an abandoned moat house in my very first adventure.
Ben, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.